The chains around Lyra's wrists were not the kind made of metal. They were made of silence, of eyes sliding past her like she was a shadow on the wall. She stood on the raised wooden platform at the center of the auction hall, her bare feet cold against the polished boards, and she counted the seconds until the crowd would send her away. Rows of alphas filled the hall below her, dressed in fine coats and polished boots, fans of parchment in their hands where they wrote their bids. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, dripping golden light onto powdered faces and jeweled collars. The air smelled of perfume and money. Lyra smelled only fear, her own, rising from her skin, like steam off a winter river. She was the last Omega of the evening. 12 had gone before her, each one paraded across the platform to gasps and rising numbers, each one claimed within minutes, by alphas, eager to win a bride, with unblemished skin, and soft, unmarked beauty. Lyra had watched them go one by one, her chest tightening with every name called, every bid accepted, every hopeful reunion between Omega and Alpha in the wings. Now it was her turn, and the hall had gone quiet in the wrong way. Lyra of Emberfall, the auctioneer announced, though his voice had none of the excitement he'd used for the others. Mr. Whitfield was a thin man with a waxed mustache, and he glanced at her the way one glances at a stain on an otherwise clean tablecloth. 22 years, skilled in herbalism and healing. He did not mention the rest, but he did not need to. The scar spoke for itself. It ran from just below her left eye, down across her cheek, over the curve of her jaw, and disappeared beneath the collar of her plain gray dress, a jagged line of pale, raised skin that caught the candlelight and made it look sharper than it was. 3 years old, that scar, and it had never stopped defining her. A murmur passed through the crowd, not admiration, not curiosity, dismissal. Lyra lifted her chin anyway. She had promised herself, walking up the steps to this platform, that she would not cry, would not shrink, would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Whatever happened next, she would meet it standing tall. "Do we have an opening bid?" Mr. Whitfield asked, though his tone made it clear he already expected silence. Silence was exactly what he got. Somewhere near the back, a young alpha laughed behind his hand, whispering something to the man beside him. Lyra did not need to hear the words to know their shape. She had heard versions of them for 3 years, ever since the raid, ever since the scar, ever since the world decided that a woman who bled for someone else's life was somehow less valuable than one who had never bled at all. She thought of Colin, her younger brother, safe now, 12 years old and sleeping soundly in the small house they shared on the edge of Emberfall, unaware that his sister stood here tonight because the healer's coin had run dry and the debts had grown too large to ignore. If no one bid on her, she would be sent to the border work camps, as the law required for unclaimed Omegas over the age of 20. Colin would be left with their elderly aunt, who loved him, but could barely feed herself. Lyra had made this bargain to save them both. She would not let it fail from cowardice now. 10 seconds, Mr. Whitfield said, tapping his gavel against his palm. 9. 8. Lyra's heart beat so hard she thought the crowd might hear it. 7. 6. A door at the back of the hall opened. It was not a grand entrance, not at first. No trumpets, no announcement. Just the quiet click of a heavy door swinging on oiled hinges, and then a wave of movement rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, every head turning toward the back of the hall. Chairs scraped. Fans stopped mid-flutter. Someone dropped a wine glass, and the sound of it shattering against the marble floor rang out sharp and clear in the sudden hush. Lyra could not see over the crowd from where she stood, but she felt the shift in the room, the way the air itself seemed to change, growing thick with a kind of reverence she had not felt all evening. "Your Majesty," Mr. Whitfield said, and his voice cracked on the second word. Lyra's breath caught. The king of the Northern Alpha Territories did not attend provincial auctions. Everyone knew that. King Draven Ashcroft ruled from the capital, 100 miles north, where the great stone castle of Ashcroft Hold rose above the cliffs like a fist against the sky. He was said to be young for a king, only 28, having taken the crown after his father's death 5 years ago. He was said to be fair. He was said to be untouchable, unmarried, unbonded, a man who had turned away every noble family's daughter, paraded before him in the years since his coronation. He was also said, in whispers too dangerous to speak aloud in most company, to have a temper that could level a room. Lyra watched him walk down the center aisle, and for a moment, she forgot to be afraid of her own fate, because the sight of him eclipsed everything else. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a simple black coat with no crown, no ceremonial sash, nothing to mark him as royalty except the 2 guards flanking him, and the way every single person in that hall bent their spines slightly as he passed, as though gravity itself pulled harder near him. His hair was dark, cut short and neat. His jaw was set, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made even the nobles in the front row look down at their laps. He was not smiling. He looked, if anything, like a man who had walked into this hall expecting to find something specific, and had not yet found it. "Forgive the interruption," he said, and his voice carried easily to every corner of the hall without him needing to raise it. "I understand the auction is nearly finished. Your Majesty, we did not expect, that is, we would have prepared," Mr. Whitfield stammered, bowing so low his nose nearly touched his knees. "I did not send word ahead," Draven said. "I did not want preparations. I want to see who remains." His eyes moved across the room, past the seated alphas, past the empty platforms, where the 12 claimed Omegas had already been led away, and finally landed on Lyra. She felt that gaze like a physical weight, and every instinct in her screamed to look away, to hide the scar, to shrink into herself the way she had trained herself to do for 3 years. But something in his expression stopped her. He was not looking at her the way the others had. There was no curl of distaste at his mouth, no flicker of pity in his eyes. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for, and has finally found, though she could not begin to imagine why. "Continue," Draven said to Mr. Whitfield, without taking his eyes off Lyra. "You were counting down, I believe." Mr. Whitfield's hands shook as he lifted the gavel again. Yes, of course. 5, 4. Lyra's pulse roared in her ears. This was it. In 4 seconds, she would be led off this platform in disgrace, sent to a work camp on the border, and Colin would grow up without her. She dug her nails into her palms and forced herself to breathe. 3. The king raised his hand. The hall went utterly silent, silent enough that Lyra could hear the candle flames hissing in their sconces. "I bid for her," Draven said. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Mr. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed, like a fish pulled from water. Your Majesty," he finally managed, "you have not stated an amount." Draven's eyes were still on Lyra, steady, unreadable. "Then I will state one that ends this quickly." He named a sum. It was not simply large. It was staggering. More gold than the entire auction combined had raised that night. More than any Omega in the kingdom's recorded history had ever fetched. Several nobles in the front rows actually rose halfway out of their seats, as though their bodies had reacted before their minds could catch up. Lyra's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the edge of the small railing beside her to stay upright, certain she had misheard, certain this was some kind of cruel performance, meant to humiliate her further. A joke played at her expense in front of the entire province. "Sold," Mr. Whitfield said, his voice thin with disbelief, the gavel falling from nerveless fingers, to strike the podium with a hollow crack. "To His Majesty, King Draven Ashcroft." The hall erupted into a storm of whispers, 100 conversations breaking out at once, nobles leaning toward each other, with wide eyes and scandalized mouths. Lyra heard none of the words clearly, only the roar of blood in her own ears as Draven walked toward the platform, his guards falling into step a respectful distance behind him. He climbed the 3 short steps and stopped in front of her, close enough now that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the small details a distant crowd could never notice. Up close, he was younger looking than she'd expected, and there was something almost gentle in the way he held himself despite his obvious strength, as though he had learned, somewhere along the way, to be careful with the space around him. "You're trembling," he said quietly, so only she could hear it over the noise of the crowd. It was not an accusation. It sounded almost like concern. "I don't understand," Lyra whispered. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, cracked at the edges. "Why would you—" "That amount, for me." "Not here," he said, glancing briefly at the sea of watching faces below them, the nobles straining to catch every word. "I'll explain everything. You have my word." He extended his hand toward her, palm up, an offer rather than a command, and Lyra stared at it for a long moment. Every instinct told her this was too strange, too sudden, too impossible, to be anything but a trap of some kind, a cruelty dressed up as rescue. But the alternative was the border camps, was leaving Colin behind, was a life she had already resigned herself to losing an hour ago. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and he helped her down from the platform with a care that startled her more than the bid had. As they walked together toward the hall's grand doors, the crowd parting before them like water around a stone, Lyra caught fragments of whispered speculation, half of it scandalized, half of it awed, all of it aimed at her back like arrows. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, and a black carriage waited at the base of the marble steps, its lanterns glowing amber against the darkness. A driver stood ready at the reins, and one of the king's guards moved ahead to open the carriage door. Draven paused before helping her inside, turning to face her fully for the first time since the platform. Up close, in the moonlight, she could see his eyes were a deep gray, like storm clouds before rain. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "That I've made some mistake, or that this is some cruel game." "Isn't it?" Lyra asked, before she could stop herself. 3 years of silence had made her careful with her words, but exhaustion and shock had worn away her filters. Something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like sorrow. "No," he said. "I have wanted to find you for a very long time. I simply didn't know your name until tonight." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "Find me? I don't know you. I've never even been to the capital." "You will understand soon," Draven said, and there was a weight in his voice, a gravity that told her this was no small thing he carried. "Tonight, I only ask that you trust me long enough to hear the truth. After that, if you wish to leave, I will not stop you." She studied his face, searching for the lie she was certain must be hiding somewhere in it, the cruelty she had learned to expect from every stranger who looked at her too closely. She found none. Only that same steady, searching look he had given her from across the auction hall, as though she were something precious rather than something broken. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me the truth." Draven nodded once, and helped her into the carriage. As the door closed and the horses began to pull them away from the auction hall, away from the province of Emberfall, toward a future she could not yet imagine, Lyra pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window and watched the lights of the only home she had ever known disappear into the darkness behind them. She did not know, in that moment, that she was leaving behind more than a town. She was leaving behind an entire life, built on the assumption that she was worth nothing to anyone. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that the scar she had spent 3 years trying to hide would soon become the very thing that saved her, or that the silent, storm-eyed king sitting across from her carried a debt in his heart that he had waited years to repay. All she knew, as the carriage rattled north through the darkness, was that for the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her scarred face and seen something worth everything he had. The carriage ride to Ashcroft Hold took the better part of 2 days, and Lyra spent most of it in silence, watching the countryside change from the gentle hills of Emberfall to the sharper, colder landscape of the north. Draven did not press her to talk. He seemed content to let her watch the world pass by, occasionally pointing out a landmark or naming a village they passed, his voice calm and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. It was strange, being treated with such patience. Lyra had spent 3 years bracing herself for cruelty, for the sharp words and sideways glances that came whenever people noticed her scar. She kept waiting for Draven to slip, to reveal some hidden agenda, some cutting remark disguised as kindness. It never came. When they finally arrived at the castle, the sun was setting behind its high stone towers, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Ashcroft Hold was larger than anything Lyra had ever seen, its walls rising from the cliffside, like something carved by giants rather than built by men. Guards bowed as the carriage passed through the gates, and servants hurried to attend the horses the moment they stopped in the courtyard. Lyra stepped out of the carriage on unsteady legs, overwhelmed by the sheer size of it all. Draven walked beside her, not touching her, not guiding her by the arm the way she half expected, simply present, a steady shape at her side, as they crossed the courtyard and entered the castle through a side door meant for family rather than formal guests. "You must be tired," Draven said, as they walked down a long hallway lined with tall windows. "I've had a room prepared for you. Rest tonight. We'll talk tomorrow, when you've had time to breathe." "You're not going to explain now?" Lyra asked, surprised at her own boldness. 2 days of watching him had made her curious, despite herself, despite every instinct telling her to stay guarded. Draven paused at a set of double doors near the end of the hallway. "I could," he said, "but some truths deserve more than a hurried explanation after a long journey. You deserve rest first." He opened the doors to reveal a bedroom larger than the entire house Lyra had shared with Colin, with a canopied bed, a roaring fireplace, and tall windows overlooking the cliffs and the dark sea beyond them. A young woman waited inside, dressed in the simple uniform of palace staff, her expression open and friendly, in a way that caught Lyra off guard. "This is Elena," Draven said. "She'll see to anything you need tonight. I'll send for you in the morning." Before Lyra could respond, he inclined his head slightly and turned to leave, his footsteps fading down the hallway. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the space where he'd been, trying to make sense of a day that had turned her entire world upside down. "He's not what people say, you know," Elena said, closing the door gently behind them. She had a round, kind face, and dark curls pinned back from her forehead. "The king. People in the capital whisper all sorts of things about him, because he keeps to himself. But he's fair. Fairer than most. Do you know why he brought me here?" Lyra asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "That's not my story to tell," she said gently. "But I will say this. In the 5 years I've worked in this castle, I have never once seen him do something without a reason that mattered to him deeply. He is not a man who acts on whims." That night, Lyra lay awake long after Elena had helped her into a soft nightdress and banked the fire low. The bed was the most comfortable thing she had ever slept in, and still sleep would not come. Her mind kept circling back to the auction hall, to the moment Draven's eyes had found hers across that crowded room, to the strange certainty in his gaze, as though he had recognized something in her that she could not see in herself. She thought of her scar, tracing its familiar shape with her fingertips in the darkness. 3 years since the raid on Emberfall's outer farms. 3 years since rogue wolves from a broken pack had swept through the fields at dusk. 3 years since she had thrown herself between one of the raiders and a group of terrified children hiding in the grain stores, Colin among them. She remembered the pain, sharp and blinding, and the strange calm that had followed it, the certainty that she would rather bleed than watch a single child fall. She had never regretted the choice, not once, even as it cost her every ounce of standing she'd once had in Emberfall's small Omega community, even as suitors who had once called on her stopped coming, even as neighbors began to look at her with a mixture of pity and discomfort rather than the warmth they'd once shown. The scar had become a wall between her and the rest of the world, a permanent reminder etched into her skin. She fell asleep, eventually, still turning over the mystery of a king who had crossed a province and offered a fortune for a scarred Omega he claimed to have been searching for, though she could not imagine what connection existed between them. Morning came gray and quiet, mist curling low over the cliffs outside her window. Elena arrived with a simple breakfast and a change of clothes, soft blue fabric far finer than anything Lyra owned, and informed her that the king would receive her in his private study within the hour. The study, when Lyra was led to it, was smaller than she expected for a king, warm and lined with shelves of books, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the early hour. Draven stood near the window, looking out over the sea, and turned when the doors opened. "Thank you for coming," he said, as though she'd had any real choice in the matter, as though she were a guest, rather than a woman he had purchased at auction the night before. He gestured to a pair of chairs near the fire. "Please, sit." Lyra sat, smoothing her skirts with hands that were not quite steady. "You said you'd explain everything." Draven took the seat across from her, and for a long moment he simply studied her face, his gray eyes tracing the line of her scar with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not curiosity, something closer to reverence. "Do you remember the raid on Emberfall's outer farms?" he said finally. 3 years passed. The autumn, the wolves came down from the broken Kaelmore pack. Lyra's chest tightened. "I was there," she said carefully. "It's where I got this." She touched her cheek without meaning to. I know, Draven said. You threw yourself in front of a raider to protect a group of children hiding in the grain stores. One of the children was a boy, no older than 4, who had wandered from the others in his fear, and stood directly in the raider's path. Lyra's breath caught. She remembered that child vividly, remembered the way he had frozen in terror, too young to understand the danger closing in around him, remembered the desperate lunge she'd made to pull him back, the burning pain that followed, as the raider's claws found her face instead of the boy. How do you know that? She whispered. Draven's jaw tightened, some old grief moving behind his eyes. Because that boy was my nephew, he said. My sister Mira's son. His name is Toby. He was visiting Emberfall with his mother that autumn, staying with distant relatives while I was occupied with matters in the capital. When I received word of the raid, and later heard what had happened, I made inquiries. I learned there was a young healer's assistant who had saved him, at great cost to herself. I searched for her name for years, through every report and record I could find, but the trail always went cold. Emberfall is a large province, and healer's assistants do not always leave clear records behind. Lyra stared at him, understanding dawning slowly, painfully, like sunrise breaking through fog. You didn't buy me because you wanted a mate, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You bought me because you recognized the scar. I recognized more than the scar, Draven said quietly. The moment I walked into that auction hall and saw your face, I knew. I have carried this debt for 3 years, Lyra. I did not know your name until Mr. Whitfield spoke it aloud last night, and even then, I could not be entirely certain until I saw your scar up close. But I knew the shape of the story. I knew what that mark meant. And I could not, in good conscience, watch a woman who saved my nephew's life be sent away to a work camp while every alpha in that hall looked past her, for the sake of unmarked skin. Something in Lyra's chest cracked open, an old, tightly held grief finally finding room to breathe. She had spent 3 years believing her scar had cost her everything, had made her invisible, worthless, forgotten. She had never once imagined that somewhere, a king carried gratitude for the very thing that had made the rest of the world look away. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to say anything, Draven said. I want to be clear about something, Lyra. I did not bring you here to claim you as a mate against your will. The bid I made was to save you from the camps. Nothing more, nothing less. You are free to stay here as a guest, to build whatever life you wish within these walls, or if you prefer, I will arrange for your safe return to Emberfall, with enough coin to settle whatever debts drove you to that auction in the first place. The choice is entirely yours. Lyra sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with everything she had expected a king to be. She had braced herself for demands, for expectations, for the quiet cruelty of a stranger who believed his gold had purchased more than her freedom from the camps. Instead, he had given her a choice. It was, she realized slowly, the first true choice anyone had offered her in 3 years. Days passed at Ashcroft Hold, and slowly, cautiously, Lyra began to settle into a life she had never imagined for herself. She was given her own set of rooms overlooking the eastern gardens, filled with books and soft furnishings, and though she still expected, some mornings, to wake and find it had all been a dream, the castle remained solid and real around her. She met Toby on her 4th day there, in the small courtyard garden, where the boy liked to chase butterflies among the hedges. He was 7 now, taller than she remembered from that terrifying autumn afternoon 3 years ago, with the same dark curls as his mother, and a gap-toothed grin that appeared the moment he spotted her sitting on a garden bench with a book she wasn't really reading. You're the lady with the scar, he said, with the blunt honesty only children possess, running up to stand in front of her with his hands on his hips. Uncle Draven said you saved my life. Lyra set the book down, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of nerves and tenderness. Do you remember that day? She asked gently. Toby considered this seriously, his small face scrunched in thought. A little, he said. I remember being scared, and I remember someone grabbing me and pulling me back, and then there was a lot of noise, and my mother was crying. He tilted his head, studying her scar with open curiosity, rather than the discomfort adults so often showed. Did that hurt? Your face? It did, Lyra admitted, but I would do it again. Toby seemed to accept this answer, With the simple logic of childhood, and without any further ceremony, he climbed onto the bench beside her and asked if she wanted to see the frog he'd caught earlier that morning. Lyra found herself laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and something in her chest loosened, some tightly wound thread finally beginning to unspool. It was Elena, later that week, who told her the rest of the story, the part Draven had not shared. Mira, Draven's sister and Toby's mother, had died 2 years ago, from a fever that swept through the northern villages, leaving Toby in Draven's care. The king had raised his nephew alongside the burdens of ruling a kingdom, and though the castle staff spoke of him with respect, Elena confided that there was a loneliness to him that no one quite knew how to reach. "He dotes on that boy," Elena said, folding fresh linens as she spoke, "but I think some part of him has never forgiven himself for not being there the day of the raid. He was in the capital, dealing with border disputes, when it happened. He's never said as much, but I think he believes he should have been the one to protect Toby, not a stranger passing through Emberfall." Lyra turned this over in her mind for days afterward, watching Draven with new understanding whenever their paths crossed in the castle halls. He was not, she realized, a man burdened only by the weight of a crown. He carried grief quietly, tucked behind steady eyes and measured words, grief for a sister he had lost, grief for a debt he could never fully repay, no matter how much gold he offered at an auction. Not everyone in the castle greeted her arrival with the same warmth as Elena and Toby. Word of the king's unprecedented bid had spread through the capital within days, and with it came a wave of scrutiny Lyra had not anticipated. Nobles who visited the castle on official business regarded her with open curiosity, some polite, most not. She overheard whispers in hallways that stopped abruptly when she rounded a corner, felt eyes tracking her across dining halls, noticed the way certain courtiers' smiles never quite reached their eyes. The sharpest scrutiny came from Lord Cassian, Draven's cousin, and a senior member of the royal council. Lyra met him for the first time nearly 2 weeks after her arrival. During a formal dinner, Draven had insisted she attend, gently, without pressure, simply an invitation she was free to decline. She had chosen to go, curious about the world she now found herself living in. Cassian was a tall man with sharp features and an easy, practiced smile that never quite settled into warmth. He approached her before the meal began, bowing with exaggerated politeness that felt more like mockery than respect. "So this is the woman who has captured our king's attention," he said, his eyes flicking over her scar with a directness that made her skin prickle. "I must say, the stories did not do the situation justice. An entire fortune for an unbonded healer's assistant from Emberfall. Remarkable." "It was not a purchase of affection, my lord," Lyra said carefully, remembering Draven's own words to her that first morning. "His Majesty explained his reasons to me privately." "Did he?" Cassian said, his smile sharpening. "How fortunate that you were given an explanation the rest of the council was not. Tell me, does the explanation account for why our king has neglected 3 separate marriage proposals from noble houses in the 2 weeks since your arrival, each one offering considerable strategic advantage to the crown?" Lyra did not have an answer for that, and something in Cassian's expression told her he had expected as much. He inclined his head once more, the gesture somehow managing to feel like a threat rather than a courtesy, and moved away to greet other guests, leaving Lyra standing alone, with a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She did not mention the encounter to Draven that evening, uncertain what good it would do, uncertain whether voicing her discomfort would only add weight to whatever suspicions already circled her like the storm clouds so often visible from the castle's high windows. Instead, she retreated further into the small pockets of peace she had found. Her mornings with Toby in the garden, her quiet conversations with Elena, the growing familiarity of the castle's winding halls. Draven noticed her withdrawal, though. He always seemed to notice more than she expected. "You've been quiet since the dinner," he said one afternoon, finding her in the castle's small library, where she had taken to spending her free hours among the shelves of medical texts and herbal compendiums, subjects that reminded her, in some small way, of the life she'd left behind in Emberfall. "I'm simply adjusting," Lyra said, not quite meeting his eyes. "It's a great deal to take in." Draven studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he could see straight through the careful evasion in her answer. "Cassian spoke to you," he said finally. "It was not a question." Lyra's silence was answer enough. Draven's jaw tightened, a flash of something sharp and protective crossing his features before he mastered it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have prepared you better for the reaction your presence would cause among certain members of my council. Cassian believes, not without some justification, that a king's choices should always serve the strength of the crown above all else. He does not understand personal debts the way I do." "I will speak with him." "Please don't," Lyra said quickly. "I don't want to be the cause of more tension than I already am." "You are not the cause of anything," Draven said, his voice firm. "Cassian's discomfort is his own to manage. I will not have you made to feel small in my own castle, Lyra, not after everything you sacrificed for my family." There was something in the way he said her name, steady and certain, that settled some of the unease still coiled in her chest. She had spent 3 years believing herself invisible, unworthy of protection or consideration, and here was a king, standing in a quiet library, promising to shield her from the very court that surrounded him. "Thank you," she said softly, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could convey. Draven nodded, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease. "There is something else," he said, after a moment's hesitation. "I have been thinking, since your arrival, about how best to make use of the time you've spent here. Elena tells me you trained as a healer's assistant in Emberfall, before the raid changed things." "I did," Lyra said, surprised by the shift in subject. "I studied under the village healer for nearly 4 years. I had hoped to take over her practice eventually, before circumstances made that difficult. The castle's healing hall has been shorthanded since our previous head healer retired last spring," Draven said. "It's honest work, useful work, and it would give you purpose here, beyond simply existing as my guest, if that is something you might want." Lyra stared at him, momentarily too surprised to respond. Of everything she had expected from her new life at Ashcroft Hold, she had not anticipated being offered work, a role, a reason to rise each morning beyond gratitude for her own survival. "You would trust me with that?" she asked. "I would trust you with far more than that," Draven said, and something in his tone made her pulse quicken in a way she did not fully understand yet. She accepted the offer the following morning, and within days, found herself settling into the castle's healing hall, alongside 2 elderly healers who had served the Ashcroft family for decades. The work was familiar in a way that steadied her. The careful measuring of herbs, the gentle tending of wounds, the quiet satisfaction of easing someone's suffering. For the first time since the raid 3 years ago, Lyra felt less like a woman defined by her scar, and more like a woman defined by what her hands could do. Slowly, though the whispers in the halls did not entirely fade, and Cassian's cold civility never warmed, Lyra began to feel something she had not expected to feel again. She began to feel, cautiously, like she belonged somewhere. Weeks passed, and though Lyra's days took on a comfortable rhythm, the nights remained harder. She would lie awake in her soft canopied bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Kindness, in her experience, rarely lasted. It had a way of curdling into something else the moment she let her guard down, the moment she began to believe it was real. She kept a careful distance from Draven during those weeks, even as their paths crossed more often than either of them likely planned. He would find reasons to visit the healing hall, checking on the well-being of injured guards, or simply passing through on his way elsewhere. And each time, Lyra noticed the way his eyes would find her before anything else in the room. She told herself it meant nothing, that a king simply took interest in the workings of his own household, that she was reading too much into ordinary courtesy. It was harder to convince herself of that after the incident with the stable hand. A young man named Petrus, one of the castle's stable workers, had been kicked badly by a startled horse, his leg broken in 2 places. Lyra had been the one to set the bone, working with quiet precision, while the older healers assisted with the more complicated wrapping, and by the time the boy was resting comfortably with a dose of pain-easing tincture in his system, word of the incident had already reached the castle's upper halls. Draven arrived at the healing hall within the hour, his expression tight with concern, that Lyra initially assumed was for the injured stable hand. It took her a moment to realize, watching the way his gaze swept the room and settled on her, whole and unharmed, that some of that concern had been for her. "I heard there was an accident," he said, once he'd confirmed Petrus was stable and resting. "They said you were the first to reach him." "It's my work," Lyra said simply. I don't run from injuries, Your Majesty. I know, Draven said, and something in his voice made it clear he had not doubted that for a moment. I simply wanted to see for myself that you were unharmed. Lyra studied him, trying to read the layers beneath his simple concern, and found herself, not for the first time, unable to fully untangle what she saw there. Why does it matter to you? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The walls she'd built over 3 years cracking slightly at the edges. I understand the debt you feel toward me for Toby's sake, but this feels like more than debt. Draven was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its careful, measured quality, replaced by something rawer, more honest. It is more than debt, he admitted. I will not pretend otherwise, though I understand if that troubles you. I did not expect, when I offered that bid at the auction, that I would come to care for the woman behind the scar as much as I honored the sacrifice she made, but I do, Lyra. More each day. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the healing hall around them seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet space between honesty and fear. I don't know how to trust that, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Every person who has looked at me since the raid has seen the scar first. You looked at me and saw something worth an entire fortune. I keep waiting to understand what that means, and I keep coming up empty. Then let me be patient, Draven said. I am not asking you to trust me today, or tomorrow, or even next month. I am only asking that you allow yourself the chance to see whether that trust might be earned. In time. I have no intention of rushing you toward anything you are not ready for. There was something steadying in the simplicity of that promise, something that eased, just slightly, the tightly coiled fear Lyra had carried since the moment she stepped off that auction platform. She did not answer him that day, not directly, but something shifted between them regardless, a small crack of light finding its way through walls she had spent 3 years reinforcing. Over the following weeks, that light grew, slowly, carefully. Draven began joining her some evenings in the castle gardens, where they would walk together and talk of small things at first, her memories of Emberfall, his early years learning to rule under his father's exacting guidance, the books they'd both loved as children. Gradually, the conversations grew deeper, touching on grief and fear and the strange, unexpected turns a life could take. Lyra found herself, despite every instinct warning her to remain guarded, beginning to look forward to those evening walks more than any other part of her day. Draven listened when she spoke, really listened, in a way that made her feel, for the first time in years, like her words carried weight beyond the scar that framed her face when she spoke them. Colin, too, became part of their growing world. Lyra had written to her brother within her first week at the castle, and Draven, without her asking, had arranged for the boy to be brought north to visit, along with their aunt, so that Lyra would not be entirely cut off from the family she had sacrificed everything to protect. Colin arrived wide-eyed and overwhelmed by the size of the castle, but he settled quickly, charmed by Toby's boundless energy, and delighted to find his sister safe, well, and, in a way he did not yet have the words for, happier than he had seen her in years. You like him, Colin said one evening, watching Draven from across the garden where the king was teaching Toby how to properly hold a practice sword, patient and careful despite the demands of his crown pulling at him from every direction. I don't know what I feel yet, Lyra admitted, though even as she said it, she suspected it was no longer entirely true. You're smiling, Colin pointed out, with the blunt observation only a younger brother could offer. You didn't smile much, back home. Not since. He stopped himself, glancing at her scar, and then quickly away, still careful, even now, around the subject that had shaped so much of their lives. Since the raid, Lyra finished gently. It's all right, Colin. You can say it. I just mean, Colin said, maybe it's okay to let yourself be happy here. Even if it feels strange. Lyra watched Draven laugh at something Toby said, the sound warm and unguarded in a way she rarely heard from him in more formal settings, and felt something in her chest settle, quietly, like a bird finally choosing to land after circling too long above a place it feared might not hold it. Not everyone shared in the castle's growing warmth toward her, though. Cassian's cool distance had hardened, in recent weeks, into something closer to open hostility, and Lyra had begun to notice the way certain council members watched her more closely whenever she crossed paths with Draven in the castle's public halls. She did not yet understand the full shape of the danger gathering around her, but she felt it, the way one feels a storm building on the horizon long before the first drop of rain falls, and she began, quietly, to wonder how much longer the fragile peace she had found within these walls could hold. The summons came on a gray morning, delivered by a palace page who found Lyra in the healing hall, her hands still stained faintly with crushed herbs from the morning's work. The royal council requested her presence, the boy explained nervously, at the midday session in the great hall. It was, he added, an unusual request. Council sessions rarely included anyone outside the king's official advisors. Lyra's stomach twisted with unease as she washed her hands and changed into a simpler gown suitable for a formal appearance. She had felt the tension building around her for weeks now, the sideways glances, the conversations that quieted when she entered a room, and some instinct told her this summons was not simply procedural. She found Draven waiting outside the great hall when she arrived, his expression tight with barely contained frustration. "I did not authorize this," he said, before she could ask. "Cassian called an emergency session this morning while I was occupied with border reports. By the time I learned of it, the summons had already been sent."
"What does he want with me?"
Lyra asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "Nothing good," Draven said grimly. "Stay close to me, and let me handle whatever he's planned. You are not obligated to answer questions you find inappropriate." The great hall was a vast, echoing chamber, its high ceilings supported by carved stone pillars, a long table stretching down its center, where a dozen council members sat in formal robes of deep blue and silver. Cassian sat near the head of the table, close to the empty seat reserved for the king, and his expression, when he spotted Lyra entering beside Draven, held a satisfaction he did not bother to hide. "Thank you for joining us," Cassian said smoothly, rising slightly in greeting, a gesture that felt more theatrical than respectful. "I apologize for the unusual nature of this summons, but certain concerns have reached a point where the full council felt they required direct address." "You had no authority to summon anyone to this hall without my knowledge, cousin," Draven said, his voice carrying an edge of warning as he took his seat at the head of the table, gesturing for Lyra to sit in a chair positioned near his own. "The council retains certain rights of emergency session, as you well know," Cassian replied, unbothered by the rebuke. "And I believe, given the circumstances, this qualifies. Your Majesty, it has now been nearly 2 months since you brought this woman into the castle, under highly unusual circumstances. Rumors have begun to spread, not only within these walls but throughout the capital itself, questioning your judgment, your fitness to rule, and whether some manner of Omega influence has clouded your decision-making." A murmur of unease moved through the assembled council members, and Lyra felt her face heat, though she forced herself to keep her chin level, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the trembling she fought to hide. "Omega influence," Draven repeated, his voice deceptively calm, in a way that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You are suggesting that Lyra has bewitched me, cousin, that an unbonded healer's assistant has somehow overridden the will of a king through some manner of forbidden magic?" "I am suggesting," Cassian said, his composure beginning to fray slightly under the weight of Draven's stare, "that a king who spends an unprecedented fortune on an unclaimed Omega, brings her into his household, elevates her to a position within his healing hall, and now walks with her in the gardens each evening, has given this council reasonable cause for concern. You have not claimed her, Your Majesty. You have not bonded with her, formally or otherwise, and yet you have upended a decade of careful marriage negotiations, with 3 separate noble houses, negotiations that would have strengthened this kingdom's borders and alliances considerably. The council deserves an explanation." Lyra felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes settle on her, and for a moment, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear, to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible, rose up so strongly she nearly acted on it. But she thought of Colin, thought of Toby's easy trust, thought of Draven's steady voice promising to shield her, and she forced herself to sit taller instead. "If I may," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, cutting through the murmur, before Draven could respond on her behalf. Several council members looked startled that she had spoken at all. "My Lord Cassian is correct that I have no bond with the king, formal or otherwise. I have no claim to influence over his decisions, beyond whatever honest conversation passes between 2 people who have come to know each other over these past months. I did not ask to be purchased at that auction. I did not ask for a position in the healing hall, though I am grateful for the chance to use my training. Every kindness shown to me in this castle has been offered freely, not extracted through some manner of trickery I would not know how to perform even if I wished to. Pretty words, Cassian said, though something in his expression suggested her directness had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. But words are easily spoken. The council requires more than reassurance. We require clarity on the king's intentions, both toward the crown's future alliances and toward the woman he has installed within these walls. Draven rose from his seat, and the sheer presence of him seemed to fill the hall, drawing every eye. Then I will give you clarity, cousin, he said. 3 years ago, this woman threw herself between a raider's claws and my nephew, a child of 4 years old, who would otherwise have died that autumn afternoon. She bears the scar of that choice on her face for the rest of her life, a scar that cost her standing, suitors, and community in her home province, while I remained safely in this castle, unaware of the sacrifice made on behalf of my family. When I learned the truth of what happened, I made a promise to myself that if I ever found the woman responsible, I would ensure she never again wanted for safety or dignity. That promise is why I bid for her at that auction. It is not influence, cousin. It is honor. And I would remind this council that honor has built more lasting alliances in this kingdom's history than every calculated marriage negotiation combined. The hall fell silent, and Lyra watched, astonished, as several council members who had entered the room with skeptical expressions now regarded her with something closer to respect, murmuring among themselves at the story they had not previously heard. Cassian's jaw tightened, his earlier confidence visibly shaken, though he was not yet ready to concede the point entirely. Honor is admirable, cousin, he said carefully, but this kingdom requires more than sentiment to secure its future. The council will expect clarity on your intentions moving forward, whether this woman remains a guest within these walls, or whether her position here will formalize into something the crown must officially account for. When I am ready to make that decision, Draven said, his voice final, the council will be the first to know, as tradition requires. Until then, I expect Lyra to be treated with the same respect afforded to any guest of this household. Is that understood? A chorus of murmured agreement moved down the table, though Lyra noticed Cassian's silence lasted a beat longer than the others, before he offered his own reluctant nod. The session ended shortly after, and as the council members filed out of the great hall, Lyra remained seated, her hands still trembling slightly in her lap despite her outward composure. Draven crossed to her side, once the last of the council had departed, kneeling briefly beside her chair so their eyes met at the same level. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle now, stripped of the commanding edge he'd used against Cassian moments before. "I don't know," Lyra admitted honestly. "I've never spoken in front of a room like that in my life. I didn't expect to." "You spoke with more courage than most of my council manages on their best days," Draven said, something like pride warming his expression. "I meant what I said to Cassian, Lyra. I will not let anyone in this castle make you feel small for the choice you made 3 years ago, or for anything that has happened since." Lyra studied his face, the steady conviction there, and felt something settle deep in her chest, a certainty she had been circling for weeks finally taking root. Whatever came next, whatever storms Cassian and the council might still stir against her, she no longer stood alone in facing them. But as they left the great hall together, Lyra could not shake the memory of Cassian's expression, in the moments before he'd finally conceded, the calculating stillness behind his eyes, that suggested this confrontation, however soundly Draven had won it, was far from the last challenge they would face. That evening, after the tension of the council session had finally begun to ease from her shoulders, Lyra found Draven in the garden earlier than usual, sitting alone on the stone bench beneath the old willow tree where they had shared so many quiet conversations over the past weeks. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, the weight of his crown pressing visibly on him, despite the confidence he had shown in the great hall. "May I join you?" she asked. He looked up, and something in his expression softened at the sight of her. "Always," he said, shifting slightly to make room on the bench. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light of evening fade over the castle walls, the sea beyond the cliffs, turning gold and then violet as the sun dropped lower. Lyra found herself studying his profile in the fading light, the tired set of his jaw, the faint lines of stress around his eyes that only appeared when he thought no one was watching. "You carry a great deal, don't you?" she said softly. "More than you let anyone see." Draven let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was little humor in it. "A king is not permitted the luxury of visible exhaustion," he said. "My father taught me that lesson early. Weakness shown is weakness exploited," he used to say. "I have tried to live by it, though some days it grows harder than others." "You don't have to be strong with me," Lyra said, surprising herself with the gentle certainty in her own voice. "Not out here, at least. Not in this garden." Draven turned to look at her fully then, something shifting behind his gray eyes, a vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface. "Do you know," he said quietly, "that you are the first person in this castle who has ever said that to me? Not my council, not my closest guards, not even Mira, when she was alive. Everyone around me has always expected strength, has needed me to provide it, has never once asked what it might cost me to carry it." "Then let me ask," Lyra said, "what does it cost you?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful, measured quality entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "It costs me the chance to grieve properly," he admitted. "My sister died 2 years ago, and I had perhaps 3 days to mourn her before the demands of ruling pulled me back into meetings and decisions and the endless machinery of the crown. It costs me relationships I might have built, had I allowed myself the vulnerability required to build them. I have spent 5 years as king, Lyra, and until you arrived in this castle, I do not believe I had a single conversation that did not, in some way, serve the interests of the crown." Lyra reached out, hesitant at first, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the cool stone bench between them. He did not pull away. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything you've carried alone." "You have nothing to apologize for," Draven said, turning his hand beneath hers, so their fingers intertwined, the gesture simple, and yet weighted, with everything neither of them had quite found the courage to say aloud. "If anything, I owe you the apology, for the scrutiny my council has placed on you today, for the whispers that follow you through these halls because of a choice I made, without fully considering the storm it might stir. I would rather face Cassian's suspicion 100 times over," Lyra said, "than have never known this. Any of it, the garden, Toby's laughter, Colin, safe and happy under this roof, you." The last word hung between them, quiet and honest, and Draven's eyes searched her face for a long moment, as though confirming he had heard her correctly. "Lyra," he said, her name carrying a weight it had never held before in his voice. "I have tried, these past weeks, to be patient, to let you find your own way toward trust, at whatever pace you needed, but I find myself needing to say this, regardless of what you choose to do with it. I have come to care for you in a way I did not expect, in a way that has very little to do with debts or gratitude anymore. I think, if I am honest with myself, it stopped being about debt weeks ago." Lyra's heart pounded, 3 years of careful walls trembling under the weight of his honesty. She thought of every reason she had built to keep herself guarded, every fear that this kindness would eventually curdle into something crueler, and found, in this quiet garden beneath the fading light, that she no longer believed those fears applied to the man sitting beside her. "I have been afraid," she admitted quietly, "of believing this could be real. Of trusting that someone could look at this scar and see anything other than a flaw, to be pitied or dismissed. But you never looked at me that way, not once, since the moment you found me on that platform." "I never could," Draven said, "because I never saw a flaw, Lyra. I saw courage. I have seen it every day since." She did not know which of them moved first, only that somehow, in the space of a breath, his hand had lifted to gently trace the line of her scar, the same mark that had made an entire hall of alphas look away in disgust, now touched with a reverence that stole the air from her lungs. When he leaned closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, she found she did not want to. The kiss, when it came, was soft and searching, careful in a way that spoke of everything he had not yet said aloud, and Lyra felt something inside her, some final wall built from 3 years of rejection, crumble quietly into dust. When they finally parted, resting their foreheads together in the deepening dusk, she found herself smiling in a way that felt entirely unguarded for the first time since the raid had changed the course of her life. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted softly. Neither do I, entirely, Draven said, his own smile matching hers. But I would like to find out, together, if you're willing. I'm willing, Lyra said. Neither of them noticed, in the warmth of that moment, the figure watching from a shadowed archway at the garden's edge, Cassian's expression unreadable as he observed the scene, before turning quietly away, already calculating what this new development might mean, for plans he had begun setting into motion weeks before, plans that had nothing to do with council sessions or formal objections, and everything to do with removing an obstacle he had decided could not be allowed to remain. In the weeks that followed the evening in the garden, life at Ashcroft Hold took on a warmth Lyra had never dared to imagine for herself. Draven made no secret of his affection now, and though he had not yet formalized any bond between them, the shift in his behavior toward her was noticed by everyone within the castle walls, from the lowest kitchen servant to the highest-ranking council member. Elena took to humming while she worked, delighted by the change she witnessed in both Lyra and the king she had served faithfully for years. Toby, thrilled to have Lyra's attention so often turned toward him, began referring to her, with the easy confidence of a child, as though the matter were already settled beyond question. Not everyone shared in the castle's growing happiness, however. Cassian's public objections had quieted since the council session, but Lyra noticed his absence from most gatherings, where she and Draven appeared together, and when their paths did cross, his civility had grown so cold it bordered on contempt. She mentioned this, once, to Garrett, the captain of the king's personal guard, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a steady, watchful presence that Lyra had come to find reassuring during her months at the castle. Lord Cassian does not take well to losing an argument, Garrett said carefully, one afternoon when he found her walking alone through the castle's eastern hallway on her way to the healing hall. But I would not worry overmuch. He has always been ambitious, and ambitious men grumble when thwarted. It rarely amounts to more than that. Lyra wanted to believe him. Most days she did. The happiness she had found with Draven, with Toby, with the life slowly building itself around her, made it easy to push aside the small, persistent unease that lingered whenever Cassian's name arose. But some instinct, honed by years of learning to read danger in the set of a stranger's shoulders or the flicker of an unkind glance, refused to fully quiet. It was Colin, of all people, who first noticed something amiss. There were men in the eastern courtyard last night, he told Lyra one morning, several weeks into autumn, as they walked together toward the healing hall, where Colin had recently begun helping with simple tasks, sorting herbs and cleaning instruments, in exchange for a small allowance he took great pride in earning. Late, after everyone had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep, so I was watching from my window. They weren't castle guards, different uniforms. Different how? Lyra asked, her earlier unease sharpening into something more alert. Darker, Colin said, frowning as he tried to recall the details. No crest that I could see. They met with someone near the old stable gate, talked for a while, and then left before dawn. I only saw it because I happened to be awake. Lyra mentioned this to Draven that evening, watching his expression grow serious as he listened to Colin's account relayed through her. It could be nothing, he said, though the tightness around his eyes suggested he did not fully believe that himself. Merchants arriving early for tomorrow's market, perhaps, or messengers from one of the border territories, arriving under cover of darkness to avoid formal announcement. But I will have Garrett look into it, regardless. It costs nothing to be cautious. Garrett's investigation, when it concluded 3 days later, uncovered little beyond confirmation that the men Colin had seen were not, in fact, registered with any merchant guild or border messenger service. Their trail went cold at the edge of the capital, swallowed up by the city's tangled streets before Garrett's men could trace it further. It troubles me, Garrett admitted to Draven and Lyra privately, in the king's study, not because of what we found, but because of what we didn't. Men who meet in shadows and leave no trail rarely have honest business. I would recommend increased vigilance around the castle grounds until we understand more. Draven agreed, ordering additional guards posted along the castle's outer walls and increased patrols through the eastern courtyard, where the meeting had taken place. For a time, the increased security seemed to settle the unease that had begun creeping through the castle, and life resumed something close to its recent rhythm of quiet happiness. But Lyra found she could not entirely shake the feeling that something was gathering just beyond her sight, some storm building slowly on a horizon she could not yet fully see. She began sleeping less soundly, waking at small sounds that would not have troubled her weeks before, and though she said nothing to Draven about the persistent unease, she noticed him watching her more closely too, as though he sensed the same gathering pressure she did. It was Toby who unwittingly provided the next piece of the puzzle, though none of them recognized its significance at the time. "Uncle Cassian gave me a new toy soldier today," the boy announced happily one evening at dinner, holding up a small wooden figure carved with impressive detail. "He said it was because I've been such a good boy lately. He asked me lots of questions about my lessons. And about you too, Lyra. He wanted to know if you and Uncle Draven walk in the garden every evening, and whether the guards patrol the same paths each night." Lyra's fork paused halfway to her mouth, a chill settling over her despite the warmth of the dining hall. She glanced at Draven, and found his expression had gone carefully neutral, in the way she had learned meant he was working hard to hide his true reaction from his young nephew. "That's kind of him, to ask after your lessons," Draven said evenly, though later that night, once Toby had been safely tucked into bed, he paced the length of his study, with a tension Lyra had rarely seen in him. "He's gathering information," Draven said finally, stopping to face her, his expression grim. "Through Toby, of all people. Using an innocent child to learn our patterns, our schedules, the guards' patrol routes. You think Cassian means to do more than simply object to me in council," Lyra said, the words settling heavy and certain between them, the fear she had been carrying for weeks, finally finding voice. "I think," Draven said carefully, "that I underestimated how far my cousin's ambition might carry him. Removing you through council pressure has failed. I fear he may be considering more direct methods." "Direct methods," Lyra repeated, her stomach twisting. "You mean he might try to hurt me?" Draven crossed the room and took her hands in his grip firm and steadying, despite the worry etched across his face. "I will not allow that," he said fiercely. "I will double the guards around you, around Toby, around this entire castle if necessary. I will not let him touch either of you." "And what about you?" Lyra asked, the fear sharpening into something colder, as a new possibility occurred to her. "If he cannot remove me through council pressure, and he cannot easily strike at me without drawing suspicion directly to himself, what happens if he decides the crown itself is the true obstacle to whatever he wants?" Draven's silence, in that moment, told her everything she feared. He had already considered that possibility, and the grim set of his jaw suggested he did not consider it unlikely. That night, for the first time since arriving at Ashcroft Hold, Lyra found herself unable to sleep at all, her mind circling endlessly through every conversation, every cold glance from Cassian, every small detail that now seemed, in hindsight, to form the edges of a threat she had not fully understood until tonight. She thought of the men in dark uniforms meeting near the stable gate under cover of darkness. She thought of Cassian's careful questions to Toby, gathering information behind a mask of familial affection. She thought of the calculating stillness she had noticed in his eyes during that first council session, and the way it had never fully left, even as his public objections quieted. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, in the shadowed streets of the capital, a storm was gathering, and Lyra understood, with a clarity that chilled her more than any winter wind, that it would not remain at bay for much longer. The attack came 11 nights later, during the castle's autumn harvest feast, when the great hall was filled with nobles and guards alike, distracted by music and food and the easy warmth of celebration. Lyra would later realize that the timing had been deliberate, chosen precisely because the castle's usual vigilance loosened during such gatherings. Guards spread thin across the grounds to manage the crowds of visiting merchants and dignitaries who came each year to mark the season's turn. She had been standing near the edge of the great hall with Elena, watching Draven speak with a group of visiting border lords, when the first sign of trouble reached her. A strange, sharp cry from somewhere near the castle's eastern gate, followed almost immediately by the clang of steel against steel. The music stopped, the hall fell into confused silence, and then, within seconds, into chaos, as a group of armed men burst through the great hall's side entrance, their faces covered, their intent immediately, terrifyingly clear. "Protect the king," Garrett's voice roared over the rising panic, guards scrambling from their positions along the hall's edges, to form a defensive line between the intruders and the raised dais where Draven stood. Lyra's training, honed through years of tending wounds in Emberfall's Healer's Hall, and sharpened further by the quiet self-defense lessons Garrett had insisted on teaching her once the earlier warnings had surfaced, took over before fear could fully claim her. She grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her toward the shelter of an overturned banquet table, shielding the younger woman with her own body as chaos erupted around them. Through the confusion, she caught sight of Cassian near the hall's far entrance, his expression tight with an urgency that did not match the confusion on the faces of the other nobles scrambling for safety. He was not fleeing toward the exits with the rest of the guests. He was moving purposefully, deliberately, toward the shadowed corridor that led to the castle's private wing, where Toby slept, unguarded, in the nursery 3 floors above. Understanding crashed over Lyra with sickening clarity. This attack was not simply chaos. It was cover, a distraction, meant to draw the castle's guards toward the Great Hall, while the true target, Toby, remained vulnerable in a nursery no one had thought to fully protect during the feast. "Watch her," Lyra told Elena, pressing the shaking woman into the shelter of the overturned table before she could protest. And then she was moving, weaving through the chaos of scattering nobles and clashing steel, following the path Cassian had taken toward the private wing. She caught up to him at the base of the tower stairs leading to the nursery, and the sight of what he was doing there stole the breath from her lungs. He was not attempting to protect his young cousin from the chaos below. He was standing over the sleeping boy's small form, a cloth soaked in some sharp-smelling liquid held ready in his hand, his expression cold and utterly without the warmth he had performed so convincingly for weeks. "What are you doing?" Lyra demanded, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear now, though fear pulsed beneath it too, cold and sharp. Cassian turned, startled, and for a moment, something like genuine surprise crossed his features before it hardened back into calculation. "I should have known you'd interfere," he said, the scarred savior, always in the wrong place at the wrong time. "You're going to hurt him," Lyra said, understanding crashing over her in waves. "This whole attack, it's not about the crown at all, is it? It's about removing Toby, the only remaining blood heir standing between you and the throne, should something happen to Draven tonight as well." "Very perceptive," Cassian said, his composure returning as he set down the cloth and instead drew a short blade from beneath his coat. "Draven has no other heir, no bonded mate, no children of his own. Remove him and the boy in the same night, and the throne falls, quite naturally, to the next eligible member of the royal bloodline. Me." "You'd kill a child," Lyra said, horror thick in her voice. "Your own family." "I would secure a kingdom's future," Cassian corrected coldly, advancing a step closer, something Draven's sentiment has consistently failed to prioritize. "Now, I would prefer not to add your death to tonight's tally, given how effectively you've managed to charm my cousin, but I will not allow you to interfere with what must happen here." Lyra did not wait for him to close the remaining distance between them. Years of quiet strength built through healer's work, through carrying wounded patients and setting broken bones, through Garrett's careful lessons in the weeks since the first warning signs appeared. All of it came together in the desperate, focused clarity of the moment. As Cassian lunged, she sidestepped, grabbing a heavy iron candle stand from beside the nursery door, and swinging it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The blow caught Cassian's arm, sending the blade clattering across the stone floor, and before he could recover, Lyra was between him and Toby's small bed, the candle stand raised again, her scarred face set with a determination that had once saved a different child on a different terrifying night. "You'll have to go through me," she said, "just like last time." Cassian's eyes flashed with fury, but before he could press his attack further, the sound of running footsteps echoed up the tower stairs, and moments later, Garrett burst through the nursery door, with a group of guards close behind him, having finally traced the same trail Lyra had followed moments before. "Seize him," Garrett ordered, and within seconds, Cassian was disarmed and restrained, his composure finally shattering into furious protest as guards forced him to his knees. Lyra lowered the candle stand with trembling hands, turning immediately to gather Toby into her arms, the boy waking now, frightened and confused by the noise and chaos surrounding him. She held him close, murmuring soft reassurances, her own heart still pounding with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "Is he all right?" Draven's voice, ragged with worry, echoed from the tower stairs moments later, and then he was there, having fought his own way through the chaos below to reach his nephew and the woman he had come to love. His eyes taking in the scene, Cassian restrained on the floor, Lyra standing protectively, with Toby held safe in her arms, understanding crashing over him, with the same horror she had felt moments before. "He's safe," Lyra said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "We're both safe." Draven crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled them both into his arms, Toby sandwiched safely between them, his relief so raw it bordered on tears he did not bother to hide. "I nearly lost you both," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Both of you, in a single night." "You didn't," Lyra said softly, pressing her forehead against his shoulder, as the last of the adrenaline finally began to drain from her limbs. "We're here, all of us." Below them, in the great hall, Garrett's guards were already securing the remaining attackers, most of them surrendering quickly once word spread that their employer had been captured, and the chaos of the feast began, slowly, to settle into the tense, watchful aftermath of a crisis narrowly survived. But in the small nursery at the top of the tower stairs, for a long moment, none of that mattered. Only the 3 of them, safe, together, and alive. In the days following the attack, the capital buzzed with news of Lord Cassian's betrayal, the story spreading through the streets and noble houses alike, with the speed only true scandal could achieve. Cassian himself was held in the castle's secure chambers, awaiting formal trial before the full council, and though he had said little since his capture, the evidence Garrett's men uncovered in the following days painted a damning picture. Months of careful planning, hired blades brought in from outside the capital, and a scheme that would have seen both Draven and Toby dead by dawn had Lyra not followed her instincts up that tower staircase. The council convened once more in the great hall, though this session bore little resemblance to the tense confrontation Lyra had endured weeks before. This time, when she entered the hall beside Draven, the council members rose from their seats, not in the reluctant courtesy she had grown accustomed to, but in genuine, unguarded respect. Word of what she had done in that nursery, standing between an armed traitor and a sleeping child, had reached every corner of the castle, and the whispers that had once questioned her worth now spoke of little else but her courage. "I owe you an apology," said one of the older council members, a stern woman named Baroness Holt, who had been among the most skeptical voices during Lyra's first appearance before the council, "and I suspect I am not alone in that sentiment. We questioned your influence over the king, when we should have been questioning our own judgment in failing to recognize what you had already proven, twice now, at great personal cost to yourself." Lyra accepted the apology with quiet grace, though she found she no longer needed it the way she might have weeks before. Something had shifted in her during those desperate moments in the nursery, some final remnant of the fear and shame she had carried since the raid finally burning away in the clarity of protecting someone she loved. Cassian's trial, when it came, was swift and thorough. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the testimony of several hired attackers who had quickly turned against him once captured, he offered little defense beyond bitter accusations that Draven's sentiment had always been a weakness the crown could not afford. He was stripped of his title and lands, and exiled beyond the kingdom's borders under permanent decree, forbidden from ever returning to the northern Alpha territories on pain of death. "You saved us both that night," Draven said to Lyra, once the trial had concluded and the castle had begun, slowly, to settle back into its familiar rhythms. They stood together in the same garden where he had first kissed her weeks before, the willow tree above them beginning to shed its autumn leaves in slow, golden spirals. "I have spent every day since trying to find the right way to thank you for that, and I find myself, still, without adequate words." "You don't need words," Lyra said, smiling as she reached up to brush a fallen leaf from his shoulder. "You've already given me more than I ever thought I deserved." Draven caught her hand before it could fall away, holding it gently between both of his own. "I want to give you more than that," he said, and something in his voice, steady and certain in a way she had come to recognize as the truest version of him, made her heart quicken. "I have spent these past months falling in love with you, Lyra, not out of debt, not out of gratitude, though both of those things remain true. I have fallen in love with your courage, your kindness, the way you have carried yourself through every trial this castle has thrown at you with more grace than I could have imagined possible. I do not want you simply as a guest within these walls any longer. I want you as my mate, my equal, my queen, if you will have me." Lyra's breath caught. 3 years of believing herself unworthy of such words finally, fully, releasing their hold on her heart. She thought of the auction platform where she had once braced herself for a life in the border camps, of the countless nights she had lain awake, convinced that no one could ever look past her scar, to see the woman beneath it. She thought of everything that had changed since, the garden, the healing hall, Toby's easy laughter, Colin's safety, and the steady, unwavering love of the man kneeling before her now, having lowered himself to one knee, without her even noticing the movement. "Yes," she said, the word emerging on a breath of laughter and tears both. "Yes, I will have you, Draven Ashcroft, scars and all." His answering smile was the brightest she had ever seen on him, and when he rose to pull her into his arms, the kiss that followed carried none of the careful hesitation of their first, but instead, the full, unguarded certainty of two people who had found, against every improbable odds, exactly where they belonged. The bonding ceremony took place on the first clear morning of winter, when frost silvered the castle gardens, and the sea beyond the cliffs lay calm and glittering under a pale sun. Lyra stood at the top of the great hall's steps, dressed not in the heavy veils and elaborate concealment that royal tradition typically demanded of a bonding Omega, but in a simple gown of deep blue that left her scar entirely visible to the crowd gathered below. It had been her choice, made deliberately, and Draven had supported it without hesitation the moment she suggested it. For 3 years, the scar had been a source of shame forced upon her by a world that valued unmarked beauty over sacrifice and courage. She would not hide it on the day she became queen. She would wear it as what it truly was, a mark of the choice that had saved a child's life, and later, in a strange and winding way, had led her to the love of her own. The crowd that filled the courtyard below was larger than any Ashcroft hold had seen in years. Nobles and commoners alike gathered to witness the joining of their king, to the woman whose courage had, twice now, protected the royal line from disaster. Colin stood near the front, beaming with pride, having grown taller and more confident in the months since arriving at the castle, his aunt beside him dabbing at happy tears with a handkerchief. Elena stood nearby, Toby's hand held firmly in her own, the boy dressed in a small formal coat that matched his uncle's, practically vibrating with excitement at his role in the ceremony. When Draven took her hands before the assembled crowd, reciting the bonding vows in a voice that carried clear and steady across the courtyard, Lyra felt none of the fear that had once defined so much of her life. She felt only certainty, warm and settled, as she spoke her own vows in return, promising herself not just to a king, but to a man who had looked past every wall she had built and seen her, fully and completely, worth everything he had offered and more. The kingdom celebrated for 3 full days following the ceremony, but it was in the quieter days after, once the formal festivities had ended and life at Ashcroft Hold settled into its new rhythm, that Lyra began the work she had been quietly planning since her earliest weeks in the castle. With Draven's full support, she brought before the council a proposal to reform the province's mating auction system entirely, replacing the practice with a voluntary matching program, overseen by trained mediators, ensuring no Omega would ever again stand on a platform and be judged, discarded, or dismissed for a scar, a mark, or any other trait that had nothing to do with their true worth. The council, humbled by recent events and increasingly devoted to their new queen, passed the reform with far less resistance than Lyra had feared. Within a year, the old auction halls across the northern Alpha territories stood empty, their platforms dismantled, replaced by community centers where Omegas and Alphas alike could choose their own paths forward, free from the cold calculation of a crowd's passing judgment. Lyra continued her work in the healing hall long after becoming queen, insisting that her new title changed nothing about the purpose she had found in tending to those who needed her care. She trained other healers in time, passing on the skills she had learned in Emberfall so many years before, and though her scar remained, faded slightly with the passing seasons but never fully gone, she no longer thought of it as a mark of shame. It had become, instead, a quiet reminder of everything she had survived, and everything that survival had ultimately brought her. On quiet evenings, she and Draven still walked together beneath the old willow tree in the garden, sometimes joined by Toby chasing butterflies through the hedges, sometimes by Colin sharing stories of his latest lessons, sometimes simply the two of them, hand in hand, watching the sun set gold and violet over the cliffs and the sea beyond. She had once believed, standing cold and afraid on an auction platform, that her scar had cost her everything worth having in the world. She understood now, years later, standing as queen beside a man who had never once looked away from her, that the scar had cost her nothing at all. It had only been waiting, all along, for someone brave enough to see what it truly meant, and generous enough to offer everything in return.